I'm crossing my fingers.
Meeting is now streaming live on Facebook, it says.
Hello, everyone. We're here.
All right, we're good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. I bet you we're here. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
We've had a little technical difficulty, but we're now getting ready to get started. So welcome to the program tonight. My name is Margaret Lynne Ausfeld. I'm one of the curators of the museum. And I'm joined this evening by Alice Novak, who is our curator of education here at the MMFA, and Professor Susan Willis, who's on the faculty at AUM and has served for many years as the dramaturg at ASF. So we're sponsoring this program tonight in conjunction with ASF, and we've also partnered with them to do a wonderful outdoor exhibition that you can see if you come to the Blount Cultural Park, called A Stroll with Shakespeare, Boydells and the Bard. And this exhibition is based around some objects that we have in our museum's collection that we acquired a number of years ago in conjunction with a show that I'll talk about in just a minute. But the main reason we wanted to do this exhibition outdoors is, of course, for the last year, we've all been rather stuck inside. And one of the ways that we can share our collection with you and other programming here in the park is to do it outdoors. So we want to encourage you to come and enjoy A Stroll with Shakespeare, but we want to give you a little context for that tonight. So that's why I'm here with Alice and with Susan. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
And we're going to be sharing a screen with you. So Alice, if you would go ahead and share your screen with the presentation, we will get started. Okay, here we go. There we go. Okay, now, okay, so we're going to start out tonight, and one of the things that I wanted to tell you about to begin with is that the objects that we're talking about, and there we go, that's actually a good way to start with the discussion I want to have right now. That is the facade of something called Boydell Shakespeare Gallery. And it was about, it was between 1789 and 1804 that John Boydell, who was the figure that you saw on that first slide, started a program that he hoped to create an excitement about contemporary British art that really didn't exist in the 18th century. In the 18th century, there was a lot more interest on the part of art lovers and collectors in England in the art of the classical artists, such as Poussin, and other artists that were derived from the style of the Renaissance and the Baroque. So that when you're looking at works by the artists who were best known as the classic artists in England in the 18th century, such as Joshua Reynolds, for example, who was the head of the Royal Academy, you would look at those artists and you would say that that was the mainstream of art, that is academic art in the 18th century in England. Well, John Boydell was a businessman. He was actually engaged in what the English at that time would have referred to as commerce. He sold prints from a shop, and then eventually he came up with the program that was intended to basically market the work of contemporary British artists. And the way that he sought to do that was to commission them to make paintings that were based on the plays of William Shakespeare, scenes from those plays specifically. He commissioned the artist and actually paid them very well. And these were homegrown British artists that he admired and he wanted to assist. And in the bigger picture, he wanted to create a school of British art. So all of the work that he was doing to create the Boydell Shakespeare Gallery was focused on the idea of promoting the work of British artists. He did that in 3 different ways. He commissioned the paintings from these famous artists and installed them in the gallery, and that's the facade of the gallery that you're looking at right there, that was designed by John Soane, an architect. And he opened the gallery in May of 1789. He had 34 pictures that he had commissioned at that point. They increased by 55 pictures to the next year. So you can see he was expanding fairly rapidly. And then he had 84 pictures in 1796, which was sort of the high point of the gallery itself and the works that were installed there. The other parts of this project, and the ones that affect us most and what we're going to be talking about tonight, are the secondary parts, wherein the paintings that he commissioned were engraved, and they were designed to be printed in large portfolios and collected like that, or bought as a portfolio, a full one, or they were designed also as illustrations for volumes of Shakespeare's plays. So you would have the play, and there would be a plate that would be incorporated into the printed volume of that play that would be one of these Boydell paintings engravings. And they were sold that way. They were sold as sets. So that was really the way that Boydell was seeking to promote British art, both by commissioning the artists and then assisting them in selling their works. So I wanted to talk just very briefly about how we ended up with these works, because I think it's kind of a little bit of a fascinating story. We actually did at the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts in 1985, so almost 35 years ago, we did an exhibition called A Brush with Shakespeare that included works from the canon of Shakespeare's plays created by a lot of different artists, much along the lines of the Boydell project. But this was much later. It was a private collection, and we borrowed these works from private collectors and from institutions. In doing the work for that show, I became aware of the Boydell Shakespeare Gallery, because it was a very large project of the 18th century that included images from Shakespeare's plays, which was what I was researching. So go fast forward to when in 2016, we had a wonderful visit from the first folio of Shakespeare from the Folger Shakespeare Library up in Washington, D.C. One of its editions came to Montgomery, and we installed it and we did programming around it. And as part of that programming, I went out and looked for engravings from the Boydell project in order to install them with our first folio. So we were very fortunate to be able to acquire one of these volumes, and we acquired a group of them for our museum's collection. So what you're going to see when you come out to Stroll with Shakespeare are reproductions of these wonderful things that are actually in our museum's collection. And we're so grateful to have them, because it helps us to connect more closely with our sister institution across the pond. So speaking of our sister institution, I'm going to turn it over to Susan now, who's going to tell us a lot more about how Shakespeare came to be so appreciated both by artists and the public in 18th century England.
I will do my best. Thank you, Margaret, Lynne, and Alice.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You wonder why you're looking at someone other than Boydell if we're talking about the Boydell Shakespeare collection. We're actually looking at David Garrick here, a portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds. Garrick was Mr. Theatre in the late 18th century of England. He was a playwright, more importantly, an actor, and equally importantly, a theater manager. He was everything at the Drury Lane Theatre, the Drury Lane being usually the largest and most prosperous, thanks to him, of the theaters in London in the last half of the 18th century. We're really going to talk for a minute about the Shakespeare industry and how it got started. You might think, well, Shakespeare started the Shakespeare industry. But in fact, Shakespeare is not buried in Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey. While other of his contemporaries, Ben Jonson, Francis Beaumont, are buried in Poets' Corner, Shakespeare's not. And so you say, okay, that's the Renaissance view. What does that say about our all-important playwright? Well, he was, in this way, his reputation was made and not born. So we're going to watch this take place right before our eyes. The theaters closed in 1642 thanks to a Puritan parliament that outlawed public performance. They reopened in 1660 with the return of Charles, well, the return of Charles II. He was not Charles II until he was crowned. He left because his father's head was cut off, a pretty good reason. And he comes back to the return of the monarchy, and theaters reopen. But they reopen with a different aesthetic than the Renaissance aesthetic. He's been living in France, and he single-handedly brings the French neoclassical movement to England. And therefore, when Shakespeare and other Renaissance playwrights are performed, they look for neoclassical unities of time, place, and action. And while Ben Jonson and many other Renaissance playwrights have lots of plays that do this, Shakespeare has only two, Comedy of Errors and The Tempest. Otherwise, his history plays and many of his tragedies encompass much longer than a day in their timetables. They travel in Antony and Cleopatra to 3 continents. He does not use the unities, so they thought he was a genius, but sloppy. And so they set about to improve him, to fix him. And boy, did they fix him. For instance, Nahum Tate in 1681 rewrote King Lear to regularize it for contemporary tastes. He cut the fool. He gave Edgar and Cordelia a love affair so that through the play they're separated and reunited and married at the end. The play starts not with the way we start the play, or Shakespeare did, but with Edmund's soliloquy from the second scene. And at the end of the play, as we celebrate Lear's victory in the battle and the marriage of Cordelia and Edgar, Lear regains his crown and lives happily ever after. That's not the King Lear I know, but that's the King Lear that was on the stage from 1681 to 1837. Okay? That if you said King Lear, Shakespeare's King Lear, that's what everyone thought it was because that's the only one they'd ever seen. And they didn't read the first folio. So they knew what the theater showed them. So what we learned from this period of the Restoration and the early 18th century is the approach to Shakespeare is fix him, adapt him, cut him, rearrange him, rewrite him, add scenes, add characters. If you have a comic actor that's famous for playing a Scotsman, throw a Scotsman into Taming of the Shrew, which is set in Padua, Italy. But sure, have a Scottish servant, that's fine, because the audience will laugh at your comic. Add text. In other words, the 18th century approached Shakespeare the way the modern theater approaches Shakespeare. We don't so much do Shakespeare as we recreate Shakespeare by making him more like our taste. Okay, so the idea of Shakespeare as Shakespeare comes to us from the mid-18th century in the hands of David Garrick. David Garrick, who, as this illustration shows us, is equally famous as a tragedian and a comedian. Here, the muses of comedy and tragedy are pulling at him. Reports we have say he was all round better as a comedian, but very famous as a tragedian in the roles that he chose. He didn't choose roles like Othello. He chose Romeo, Lear, Hamlet, and these he excelled in. One other thing we need to be aware of before we really dive into Garrick himself is that the 18th century was the first time you could read Shakespeare in a properly edited text. During the course of the 18th century, there were 5 edited editions of Shakespeare, starting with Rose in 1709, Alexander Pope's in 1725, another in 1747, Samuel Johnson's, a good friend of David Garrick's, both of them from Lichfield, England, 1765, and a 5th one in 1790, which means that you could have Shakespeare in a contemporary text, modern spelling, modern punctuation, with introductions, with notes about the text, with its problems addressed and solved to the editor's satisfaction. And just like our world, the 18th century knew an edited text. These are the only texts most of us know as Shakespeare. We don't go back and read the folio. We don't read the first or second quarto. We read an edited text. So the 18th century, we are hotwired to the 18th century in this way, in many ways. Whatever the theaters did to the plays, and they did plenty, the texts were widely available. By the 19th century, every middle-class household in England and America would own a Baudelarized collected works of Shakespeare, okay? Garrick was impressed by Johnson's edition, but that didn't mean he used any of those plays and put them on stage. He still wanted to do the traditional plays. In other words, he still performed Nahum Tate's with Lear with a few emendations, because the 18th century audience enjoyed what was familiar to them. They would, the way we watch reruns or our favorite films on TV for the 96,000th time, they would go back and see something that was their comfort food on stage. So he shaped the plays to the taste of the patrons he wanted to come to the Drury Lane. And yet in the 18th century, the neoclassical values had run their course and new things were beginning to happen. Like Garrick's acting, which he was very famous for, things were getting more emotive. And the concern was less about the universal and more about the individual. Okay, you're ahead of me a little bit, but let's, that's okay, that's okay. Garrick was raised to be a wine merchant in his hometown of Lichfield. Instead, he used the words and plays of Shakespeare to intoxicate thousands of people. He single-handedly is credited with building the Shakespeare industry. And then after his death, Boydell takes it as a handoff and runs with it because he knows a good idea when he sees one. Garrick, go ahead and let's get the next slide, Alice. Yeah, there you go. He debuted in London in 1741 in Shakespeare's Richard III. It was a role he was exceedingly famous for. And when he opened in this role, he pledged to himself that he was going to raise the lowly status of acting as a profession. And he did by the time he retired in 1776. Actors were somebodies. They were not just the people that worked in a theater. He is 24 when he debuts as Richard III. 6 years later, at the age of 30, he is the leading actor and the theater manager at the Drury Lane. Posts he holds for the rest of his career, except for a brief foray to Covent Garden, which we will not talk about. And at his death, his extensive library was the core component of the new British Library at the British Museum. He's important in lots of different ways. What he offered as an actor that others had not to this point, the neoclassical approach to Shakespeare was oratorical, what we call in the theater, stand and deliver. You go down to the sweet spot center stage and you speak your speech. And then you move aside and the next person comes forward and speaks the speech facing the audience, not somebody else on stage. So this is what audiences had been used to. Garrick still uses much of that style, but he internalizes much more powerfully than previous actors had. He fully embodied it, as you can see in Hogarth's painting. This is the moment in Richard III where Richard at the end wakes up to the presence of the ghosts of those he has killed to get to the crown. And you can tell that body is fully kinetic. That's a wake-up call and not a happy one. He's seen something that is deeply disturbing, and Garrick had the body and voice to convince people of these big emotional moments as they proceeded through a character's role. And they would go to the theater, flock to the theater to watch him give them what was the 18th century's version of emotional truth. We might not call it emotional truth in our world because emotional truth is a sliding scale that moves through time. Every era defines it its own way, but he was it in the 18th century. But what I really want to talk about more than Garrick, the actor, is his other role as Garrick, the director and the theater manager, because he helped innovate 18th century set design. He used lavish costumes, and he and his set designer innovated a ton of stage effects. He took over the Drury Lane when it was really economically struggling, and he made it thrive. And he made himself wealthy along with that theatrical thriving. He was a consummate marketing maven. He knew how to produce it, and he knew how to sell it. The 18th century was an era that was beginning to be very aware of personal image. And for the people that count individual works of art, such as etchings and carvings of individuals through time, images of Garrick in collections are second only to images of Queen Victoria. That's how popular he made himself, how much in the forefront of society his image was. His image was everywhere. It fed his fame, simultaneously bolstering the fame of his theater and its works. He mastered PR. He could do it. He could build the excitement. He could please the audience. He could get them to want more. Okay, Alice, next one. Yes, Garrick leaning on a bust of Shakespeare, or Shakespeare leaning on Garrick. It's all in your point of view. And this is really where we're going for the rest of my chat. Garrick was strongly associated with Shakespeare, even though he only performed 8 of the plays with great regularity and always in adapted versions. But he made himself associated with Shakespeare. And as we're about to see, the issue of who's really leaning on whom can be answered in one word, and that word is Jubilee. Follow me, if you will, to Stratford-upon-Avon. In May of 1769, the enterprising Stratford Town Hall government decided they wanted a statue of Shakespeare, but they didn't have the funds to commission one. So they invited David Garrick to donate a statue to them for their town hall. He's in London, he's famous, he's got money, he'll give us a statue. He said, he thought it over, he said, all right, and published a public announcement inviting the world to Stratford-upon-Avon on September 6th, 7th, and 8th of that year for a grand jubilee in Shakespeare's honor. Stratford knew nothing about this. They have 4 months to get ready, but it's Garrick who got it ready, not Stratford. Garrick was a showman to the bone. He starts in London by stoking interest. He has newspaper articles written. He has, oh, what are they doing this week to get ready for that Jubilee? He raids absolutely every asset the Drury Lane Theatre has. Luckily for him, theaters in the 18th century did not perform in June, July, August, or early September. So he's keeping his entire theater occupied and employed by doing this Jubilee. He used the costumes from the theater, the musicians from the theater, the set designers from the theater, the carpenters from the theater. He planned a lavish 3-day spectacle celebration in what at that time was a tiny English town with unpaved streets and limited accommodations in the middle of nowhere. It had 2,200, a population of 2,200 that had really not much noticed Shakespeare since his death in 1616. Garrick, however, commissioned music. He planned balls and feasts, public spectacles, fireworks, all supposedly in praise of Shakespeare. But you notice he didn't perform a single play. Okay, we're looking at the rotunda. He had this grand rotunda built on the bank of the Avon. It could hold 1,000 people. There was a big dinner for 700 the first night of the Jubilee. Later that night, there was an amazing by invitation only ball that went on until 3 a.m. Now remember, this day, day one of the Jubilee, had started at 6 a.m. with cannon along the bank of the Avon outside the rotunda going off. So everybody woke up at 6 a.m. And if the cannon fire didn't wake you up, the ringing of the church bells would have all over town. The second day was planned with an ode and speeches, and on the day, 2,000 people filled a 1,000 head capacity rotunda to hear Garrick read his personally penned ode to Shakespeare. Later that night, there was a masquerade ball for the invited that went on until 6 in the morning. The last day, there was supposed to be a huge communal dinner in this structure. So this was a huge deal. People from London had come, people from the theater world had come. It was not so much, there were public events for Stratfordians, but mostly it was for the society. And they came and struggled to find places to stay and to deal with the unpaved streets of Stratford. But on we go. Next slide, please. Okay, they're all over town. There were pageants, there were custom-built structures. This is Bridge Street. And you can see the pageantry in the background, the military presence, everyone in military gear and everyone in every window waiting to see what's going on this next minute. This is undoubtedly day one. Everything went like clockwork, the breakfast, the pageantry, the dinner. During dinner, it started to rain. By morning, it was a torrential rain. During day two, it turned into a deluge that Noah would have recognized. They went ahead with the breakfast because that was in the town hall. But the big public event, which was an outdoor pageant of up to 200 people in the Drury Lane Shakespeare costumes, presenting dumb shows of scenes from Shakespeare, all marching all over Stratford, had to be canceled because his co-manager came and said, "We'll ruin the costumes if we take them into the rain." And Garrick said, "But we have to have the pageant." Well, no, you don't if it's raining that hard. So they postponed it and decided the costumes were more important than the pageant. Next slide, please, Alice. Because it was indoors, well, this is the pageant. You think, but that woman just said that they didn't have the pageant. But this is what the pageant would have been. All these people in sumptuous costumes marching around through Stratford. So we've got a picture of what did not happen. Just want you to know. There's reality and then there's art. Okay, folks? The fireworks, the other public event for the second day, were also rained out. You couldn't light them. They were across the river from the rotunda. Imagine walking to the rotunda for, let's look at the next slide. The ode. Garrick is your central figure. He is surrounded by what in truth were 100 musicians and singers, because this is the first time in most people, except opera goers present, that they had heard a poem recited to music. It's what in opera is recitative, but Garrick knew what he was, like I said, he's a showman. So he gives them music and singing along with his ode that he recites. And everybody flooded up to him at the end. They couldn't say enough about it. People wrote home to their families. It was amazing. It was really something. Meanwhile, the rain is pelting down outside. It is coming in through the floorboards. Doors are coming off their hinges and falling into the rotunda, okay? The structure that is the centerpiece for all the main invitees here is really falling apart around there. Imagine going home after the dinner. After this ode is read and the rest of the program done, everyone's sent out into the rain so they can reset for dinner. So then you come back in, have dinner, which was turtle. 327-pound turtle was fed to them. But who's counting? And then they went home for to get dressed for the masquerade ball and had to tromp through the mud and the water to get back to the rotunda. And the people of Stratford were standing uphill watching all this and laughing at people falling in the mud. A good time was had by all. What can I say? The last day, all that they managed to stage was the horse race, which was somewhere else in town. And the fireworks manager managed to save a few of the fireworks and send them off as a kind of parting shot. The rotunda continued to fall apart there beside the river. Interesting note, that rotunda was built very near the site of what we know as the Royal Shakespeare Theatre today. They're almost exactly on the same place at Avonside. Garrick went home and never went to Stratford again. His extravaganza had been rained out. He thought, well, that didn't go so well, but Garrick was an entrepreneur. He went back to London and in a few weeks performed the Jubilee. He performed the Jubilee pageant in his own theater. Rain it out in Stratford, who cares? I can have all London come see my pageant. And they did for 90 performances in a row. If you know anything about 18th century theater, this is astronomical as a run of anything. And it intermittently appeared in his program of play for 6 more years. He completely recouped his investment in the pageant and made a profit because he had that entrepreneurial spirit. He had the ode printed and sold. They had all the music printed and performed all over England and all over Europe. the very idea of a jubilee caught on. Goethe in Germany had a jubilee for Shakespeare, Goethe being a major Shakespeare fan. And in France, people organized a jubilee to Voltaire. So it's all good all the way time after this. So it's the idea of jubilee to someone as important as Shakespeare now is in everybody's eyes. Stratford-upon-Avon paid attention to Garrick. He wrote them a really interesting and semi-nasty note about their little town. As when they invited him to come back and do it again, he said, why don't you clean up your act before you try to get people back in Stratford? But people had heard of Stratford now. And the people in Stratford realized, just as Garrick did, that Shakespeare could be profitable. So they formed a Shakespeare Club and started redoing the Jubilee every now and then. By 1847, that Shakespeare Club, which had been doing a pageant periodically, and even by 1830 had daringly done a Shakespeare play in Stratford, the first time a play by Shakespeare had ever been done in Stratford-upon-Avon. In 1847, they prevented the birthplace from being torn down by buying it themselves for the town. The town cleaned up its act, paved its streets, lit them, became a proper place, preserved other Shakespeare properties. By the late 19th century, Mr. Flower was beginning to raise funds to start a Shakespeare theater in Stratford. And Stratford started advertising itself as a destination. Garrick's Jubilee was the making of Shakespeare's reputation in England. He made Shakespeare stand for all that is best and British. And it is the Jubilee that was his stepping stone. He also showed Shakespeare how it could become a tourist destination, the center, the epicenter of the Shakespeare industry. And now it's a must-see day tour on anyone's quick trip to England. You always drive out there, spend half a day in Stratford. You see the theater, you don't see a play, you buy a knick-knack, and you get back on the bus and you go back to London. But Stratford reaps the reward. Like the Jubilee itself, everything associated with this event was a marketing triumph, costumed as art. Now we segue to Boydell. Garrick's Jubilee was in 1769. As Margaret Lynne said, Boydell opened his Shakespeare Gallery to celebrate both Shakespeare and British art. In 1789, he employed many of the same motives and principles as Garrick did. For instance, this slide is the one I'm talking about now. In his art exhibition, you paid to get in, and then he offered you a catalog for sale. It was a pretty hefty thing because the catalog identified all the painters and then gave you the Shakespeare text from an edited edition. You will notice that the scene being depicted with the very moment in the scene that the artist chose in italics. And this was the shortest snippet from all the pictures that were showing in the Boydells and the Bard exhibit. It's Fusley's Midsummer Night's Dream from Act 2, Scene 1, the introduction of Puck. And you can see that the fourth and fifth lines are the ones italicized. When I, a fat and bean-fed horse beguile, neighing in likeness of a filly foal. Well, down in the right-hand corner is the rider and the horse that Puck have beguiled smack into the water, off the path and into the water. So you see this, and Puck as not your basic cherub in that art. The idea of Shakespeare as an inspiration for British art in the theater or on the easel is very strong in the late 18th century. And on that note, I'm bouncing this artistic ball back to Margaret Lynne to keep going about the feeling of Boydell's exhibition in his own time.
Fabulous. That is wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I enjoyed hearing all about the Kardashian of the 18th century,
Yes,
you might
yes.
say. One of the original celebrities, right?
He knew how to do it.
He did. So Alice, we can move on now, and we're going to be looking now at a painting that is by, well, oh, excuse me. First, we're going to go back just a little bit before that. We're going to talk about the project itself and the response to the project.
Yes.
And why. And in reality, that next slide, Alice, is fine. We're going to talk about this print by James Gilray, which, as you can see, is titled Shakespeare Sacrificed, or The Offering to Avarice. So Gilray is poking a stick, as they were wont to do, Susan will agree, in the 18th century, through a color engraving at Boydell, who is standing there in the foreground. You see him gesturing or conjuring. He's wearing the robes of his status as an alderman of London. And he's calling up Avarice, who is sitting there on top of a bound volume. And you can't read it there, but it says that this is his list of subscribers to the Boydell Shakespeare publications. And there's money bags under there, which he is absconding with from the subscribers. And then you see that he's basically, the intent is to suggest he's burning up Shakespeare. You see the characters up there from the Boydell engravings and paintings that were depicted by the various artists. You can see right there at the left, in the blue, sitting on that rather tornadic looking cloud, is Bottom. Mm-hmm. And we're going to see Bottom again in just a second, who is a character from Midsummer Night's Dream. The whole point of this engraving was, of course, to criticize the commercial sense of this enterprise as a venture to earn money. And obviously, Boydell was, as Susan's already said, he was a man after Boydell was a man after Garrick's own heart. He was a businessman, he was a promoter, he was a marketer. He basically had made his larger business, built his larger business, selling engravings on the continent. And having been successful at that, he wanted to figure out a way. There was a dinner party and he was talking with friends, and he wanted to figure out again a way to promote British artists who were so drastically being not patronized by the British aristocracy, who was much more interested in collecting the work of older continental artists, classical works, or commissioning landscapes and portraits from the artists of the 18th century, like Hogarth and Reynolds and Gainsborough. He wanted to offer some option to demonstrate that English artists had a viable and valid way of expressing themselves that would convey their love of country, their patriotism, and in many ways their appreciation of liberty and freedom, which the British really considered that they, within their system of England with the monarchy, had many more freedoms than most of the citizens of other countries in Europe, and they were more educated. So one of the ways to do that, he felt, was to open the doors to alternative ways of depicting imagery apart from the academic, and to allow there to be commissioned images that were not portraits and landscapes. but that were actually scenes that had stories attached to them. So Alice, we can go ahead now and look at a wonderful work by Henry Fusley, who was a foreigner. He was Swiss, but he was much beloved in England. And the works that he chose to depict from Shakespeare for the Boydell Gallery, most of them were derived from the magical plays, The Tempest, Midsummer Night's Dream. And of course, this image is the beguiling of Bottom there, who's seated in the middle of that composition. And he's surrounded by Titania and her court of fairies. And if you will closely examine where you can, you'll see that he's surrounded by very odd looking mystical creatures. At the right, you see of the composition, you see a young woman, and she's got an elderly kind of crouched over gnome attached to a leash at her feet. And that was a very unusual way of kind of conveying a sense of control and power for women. Of course, here he's really talking about Titania and her court and the women around her, and they were making fools of men, basically. And so this was one way of kind of conveying that feeling that you get when you're listening to Titania, and the whole situation gets turned around on her. But at the time that she's in control, this is what you see. You see these wonderful creatures kind of celebrating her ability to control the imagery and what was going on in the scene of the play. So with this you get the connection at how different this type of scene, this type of painting, this type of presentation was from the classical academic approach of most English artists who were working in England at the time. This was very imaginative, very creative. And this creates what the 18th century began to see as an admiration for genius and creative genius. And they inspired and basically said, Shakespeare has proven a genius in his ability as a writer, as a poet, as a playwright. We can prove our genius through originality and our ability to create these paintings that are unlike anything else that you will see in the world. We have now a unique approach to looking at this work as a narrative, but within that context, we're creating a completely unique and original presentation of it. So this is one of the ways that Boydell actually began to exploit the market, was by teaching people, just as Garrick did, the importance of Shakespeare within the canon of English, of the arts in England, and tying that for the middle class, especially, who were the ones who were signing up, subscribing, and buying the engravings, tying that to the genius of Shakespeare and thereby to the patriotic appreciation of English art. Okay, so Miss Alice, I think we can go to our last pane here. And what I wanted to do at this point was simply invite everybody who's been with us tonight. Thank you. And we want to invite you to come out and do the Stroll with Shakespeare, which is out around our large pond, the Newell Lake. And there are panels that have connections so that you can call in and listen to wonderful actors performing little snippets of scene from the Shakespearean plays that are being illustrated by the engravings that are in the museum's collection. So I think this was a little bit of a perfect marriage and of the art and the painting and ASF and MMFA. And so I'm going to thank both of you. And Alice, I'm going to flip it back to you and see, is there anything else that we need to cover in our talk tonight that we've not touched on?
Or has
Well-
anybody had a question?
Yeah.
We don't have any questions. We have had a whole lot of different people watching, but Susan, I have a question.
Okay.
Didn't David Garrick act in front of some famous military paintings in certain galleries?
Oh, he did everything. He, if it could be done, he did it. Yeah, I mean, he would take a setting anywhere he could find it.
It just seems like he was so larger than life, and
Mhm.
and it's so interesting to hear from you that sort of our Shakespeare was brought forth and held up by him and introduced to us. Very
And it's just, and the fact that Shakespeare is partly Shakespeare and partly any age's manufacture.
Mhm.
And, but that for theater is okay. I mean, you've got to have a communication like art. It's got to talk to the people viewing it, communing with it now, as well as, I mean, because I can't be in the Renaissance, much as I dream of doing it.
Mhm.
All my students will laugh now because I always say, if I had a time machine, or when I get a time machine is usually what I say. When I get a time machine, I'm going back to the Globe and seeing Hamlet first. Then I have a long list, but that's the first thing I'm doing. I'm watching Shakespeare's Company do Hamlet. Then, because I just want to, that's it. And Margaret, Lynne, where would you go if I gave you a time machine?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And you know, I'm going to tell you, I would go back to 16th century Florence if I had a time machine.
I bet you would.
Yeah, we laugh at the museum and we say, I'm the curator of dead artists, and our other curator is the curator of the live ones. And I'm perfectly happy being the curator of the deceased. Yes. It's a wonderful experience to be able, and wouldn't it be magnificent to be able to go back, and this is what I usually say, wouldn't it be magnificent to go back and look at these objects that we love so much and that we appreciate so much in a museum gallery setting? Wouldn't it be wonderful to go back and see where they were originally in a home, in a church, somewhere where they were surrounded by people who saw them with the eyes of their time? That's what really gets me is it's such a loss to us that we can't see works of art in the way that the people who were living in that era saw them. We would see so much of a different thing, I think, if we were able to do that. It's a wonderful thing to dream about. I agree.
And having talked my head off about Garrick, one of the things that cracks me up about Boydell in arranging his Shakespeare is that he told every artist not to think about the theater, to absolutely erase every image they had from the theater and to reimagine in best British fashion what Shakespeare was for the, for the modern world. So there was this, the guy who tried to make Shakespeare for the theater, and then Boydell is, no, let's do Shakespeare for art, he's universal in lots of ways.
Right.
And just gets the imagination flooding with possibilities. So.
Yeah, well, and we had that reference to Garrick being the Kardashian of his era. And there were many other, in addition to Garrick, there were lesser lights who were just as famous, and a number, it's amazing, the number of portraits of actors in costumes of their role. And it wasn't just paintings, but I mean, it was gouache paintings, watercolor paintings, little keepsake paintings. Some of the more available and still surviving images of that type are watercolor and gouache paintings that were kept as keepsakes.
Yes.
And they literally are addressed to the actor in that role. So I have a feeling Boydell may have almost looked at that as a distraction for the artist. They didn't want him to do what somebody could buy a little gouache of. They wanted a machine.
Buy my stuff.
They wanted a real machine, something you could sink your teeth into.
And one thing I'm really proud of Boydell for, he may not have been the first one, but he had a gift shop downstairs. I mean, you walked in You didn't get to see the big paintings upstairs. You walked into the little paintings downstairs and a massive gift shop
Right.
where you can buy copies, or we can, we'll sell you something. Hello.
Absolutely.
And I think that's just so wonderful. So
Yeah.
Garrick, so Boydell, so
19th or 20th century too,
Yes,
wasn't
yes.
it? Really, it's
Yeah.
the beginning of marketing for sure.
we think we're so innovative.
We do. We believe
Garrick
it.
and
but
Boydell got there.
yeah, the
It's
further
pretty
back
good.
you look, the more you discover.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
listen, Susan, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
You're
I've had
so
a
welcome.
I've had a wonderful time. I learned so much. And I know, Alice, thank you so much for setting us up and getting us going. We appreciate you.
I wish I could visit the Boydell Gallery and, as you said, see people in that day interacting. And
Yep.
it's so much fun to be able to go out around our lake and visit our Boydell Gallery.
It is wonderful. And one of the things that I really treasure about having those works in our collection is the wonderful thing you can say in a museum is we will have them forever. And as long as there's a Shakespeare festival that's doing plays by Shakespeare, as long as the museum is here, there's going to be this wonderful connection that we can call upon to tie together those arts for our community. And I'm just delighted that that is possible.
And as a Boydell footnote, if you'll allow me, if anybody's interested in seeing more about it, there is a fabulous website, but one called What Jane Saw. And it recreates the Boydell Gallery in 1796 when Jane Austen saw it, because she wrote a letter home about seeing it.
Oh, that's great.
So it's amazing. They've got all the paintings hung on the walls, and they've got the size, and they show how they learned all this stuff, but it's really swell. You can be in Boydell's gallery, Alice.
Fun.
Go right there. What Jane saw.
Right.
Take your walk. Okay.
So who needs an imagination? We have the computer.
Yes.
We have CAD design.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for the museum, for your care in so many of the arts.
Thank you very much. And thank you for being with us. Alice, any last words for us before we sign off?
Just everyone, please come out to the park, walk around the lake, view these prints, these settings, these scenes as the artists imagine them, and listen to the actors as they give them life. It's just a lot of fun. You all were great. Thank you. And thanks everyone for watching.
Indeed.
Okie doke. Thanks a lot, everyone, and good night.